Imagine a world where boys are taught to hide their tears, to swallow their feelings, and to wear a mask of invulnerability. A world where crying is seen as a weakness, and strength is defined by silence. But what if everything we thought we knew about strength was wrong? What if true courage lies not in suppressing emotions, but in embracing them? In this video, we're going to break down the walls that society has built around masculinity and explore why vulnerability is the key to emotional health, connection, and strength. It's time to redefine what it means to be strong. Number 1. Society's expectations, pressure of masculinity. The phrase "boys don't cry" has long been a mantra passed down through generations, shaping how society views masculinity and how boys are taught to navigate their emotions. From the moment they are old enough to understand, boys are often bombarded with messages that associate crying with weakness, vulnerability, and even failure. Whether it's a parent telling them to toughen up, a coach demanding they man up, or peers teasing them for showing emotion, boys quickly learn that shedding tears is seen as unmanly. These societal expectations create a rigid mold of masculinity, where strength is measured by emotional control and stoicism. This pressure doesn't just discourage crying, it teaches boys to suppress their feelings entirely, forcing them to internalize pain, frustration, and sadness. Over time, this emotional suppression becomes second nature, shaping how boys grow into men. Many find it difficult to express vulnerability, even in their closest relationships, because they fear being judged, ridiculed, or perceived as weak. The cost of this societal expectation is immense. Bottled-up emotions can lead to feelings of isolation, anxiety, and depression, as well as an inability to communicate effectively in relationships. Research shows that the stigma surrounding emotional expression among men contributes to higher rates of mental health issues, substance abuse, and even suicide compared to women. The burden of appearing strong and unshakable comes at a significant emotional cost, leaving many men feeling trapped by their own unspoken struggles. But why does society impose these rules? The concept of masculinity has long been tied to ideas of dominance, control, and invulnerability. Crying, on the other hand, is seen as a form of surrender, a moment of emotional openness that contrasts sharply with these ideals. As a result, boys are conditioned to associate tears with weakness and to fear that showing emotions will undermine their identity as men. Yet, this perspective is deeply flawed. Crying is not a sign of weakness. It is a natural, healthy response to emotional pain or overwhelming experiences. It is a universal human expression, one that knows no gender. To change this narrative, we must start by redefining what it means to be strong. True strength lies in being honest with oneself, embracing vulnerability, and understanding that emotions are not something to be feared or hidden. By teaching boys that it's okay to cry, we create a culture that values emotional intelligence and empathy. This means showing boys that expressing emotions is not only normal, but necessary for their mental health and personal growth. It requires parents, educators, and society as a whole to challenge outdated stereotypes and encourage boys to feel deeply, connect openly, and express freely. A world where boys are allowed to cry is a world where they are allowed to be human. It's a world that fosters emotional well-being, builds stronger relationships, and promotes a healthier, more inclusive definition of masculinity. Breaking the cycle of emotional suppression isn't easy, but it's an essential step toward creating a society where everyone, regardless of gender, can live authentically and without fear of judgment. Let's start by teaching our boys that crying is not a sign of weakness. It's a sign of courage, self-awareness, and strength. Number 2. Fear of judgment. One of the most pressing reasons is the fear of judgment, a fear that's instilled in boys from the moment they begin to navigate the world around them. Society teaches them, often without saying a word, that crying is a sign of weakness, a trait that, from a young age, becomes a target for ridicule. It starts in subtle ways, perhaps when a boy is told to man up after falling off his bike, or boys don't cry when he's upset over a personal loss. These messages, often passed down by well-meaning parents, teachers and peers, send a clear signal, showing emotion is something to be ashamed of, and crying is reserved for the weak. The problem is, this kind of judgment doesn't just affect how boys feel in those moments of vulnerability. It shapes their emotional landscape for years to come. As boys grow, this fear of judgment only intensifies. From early childhood into adolescence, boys are conditioned to believe that any sign of weakness will make them targets for bullying, exclusion, or mockery. The fear of being seen as soft or sensitive can become overwhelming, and the pressure to fit into a narrow definition of masculinity becomes inescapable. Imagine a teenage boy standing in the hallway of his school, facing an emotional setback. The urge to cry is strong, but he holds back because he knows that his peers may not understand. The judgment could come in the form of teasing, snickers, or worse, being labeled as weak. This pressure to maintain composure and suppress emotional expression doesn't just come from peers. It can also come from family dynamics. A father might unknowingly reinforce the idea that his son must be strong and don't cry, perpetuating the idea that vulnerability is something to hide. This fear of judgment, deeply ingrained and constantly reinforced, leads boys to develop a pattern of emotional suppression. They begin to view their own tears as something to be ashamed of, pushing their emotions deeper and deeper inside. The longer they bottle up these feelings, the harder it becomes to express them. Over time, this emotional repression can lead to serious mental health issues, including depression, anxiety, and even anger. Boys learn to wear a mask, projecting an image of toughness, control, and emotional invulnerability, even as they suffer in silence. This is the tragic irony. While trying to avoid judgment and maintain a facade of strength, many boys end up feeling more isolated, disconnected, and emotionally distant. The fear of judgment also impacts how boys develop emotional intelligence and empathy. When emotions are something to be hidden, it becomes difficult for boys to learn how to express themselves healthily or understand the emotions of others. This emotional disconnect can affect their relationships, making it harder for them to connect deeply with friends, family, and future partners. They may struggle with vulnerability, and without the tools to process and express their feelings, their emotional growth is stunted. Boys who fear judgment may also be less likely to seek help when they need it, whether it's in the form of therapy, emotional support, or simple reassurance from loved ones. But it doesn't have to be this way. The fear of judgment can be dismantled, and it starts with challenging societal expectations around masculinity. We need to redefine what it means to be strong. True strength doesn't come from bottling up emotions. It comes from the courage to face them, to express them, and to seek support when needed. By teaching boys that crying is a healthy, natural expression of emotion, we can begin to break the cycle of emotional suppression. This means creating environments where vulnerability is not met with judgment, but with understanding and acceptance. Whether it's through supportive family dynamics, positive role models, or safe spaces in schools, we need to show boys that emotions, including crying, are a part of the human experience. They don't make someone weak, they make someone real. Imagine a world where boys are free to cry without fear of judgment, where expressing their feelings is seen as a sign of strength rather than a flaw. In such a world, emotional intelligence would be celebrated, and boys would grow into men who are not afraid to be vulnerable, to express their emotions, and to build deeper connections with those around them. This would create healthier, more compassionate individuals and more fulfilling relationships. The fear of judgment would no longer dictate their emotional experiences, and crying would no longer be seen as an act of weakness, but as an expression of strength, resilience, and humanity. Number 3. Cultural and familial influence. The phrase "a boy doesn't cry easily" is deeply ingrained in many cultures, shaping how young boys are raised and how they learn to process their emotions. From the moment they are born, cultural and familial influences begin to mold their understanding of what it means to be a man, and emotions, especially vulnerability, are often placed outside of the boundaries of acceptable behavior for boys. Families, particularly those with traditional values, often encourage their sons to be tough, pushing them to stifle any emotional expression that doesn't align with societal expectations of masculinity. Fathers, in particular, may feel pressure to model strength and resilience, passing down unspoken rules about what it means to be a man. In many families, there's an unspoken belief that a boy should be strong, unemotional, and in control of his feelings at all times. These ideals come from a place of love and protection, as parents want their children to succeed in a world that values strength and self-reliance. But the underlying message is clear: emotions like sadness and fear are to be avoided. At the same time, cultural influences play a significant role in reinforcing these expectations. In many societies, men are expected to be the breadwinners, the protectors, and the ones who keep their families safe from emotional turmoil. These pressures often manifest in the subtle and sometimes not so subtle ways boys are raised. For example, in certain cultures, emotional restraint is seen as a sign of maturity, while openness and vulnerability are labeled as soft or weak. The media, too, plays a powerful role in reinforcing these stereotypes. From action heroes in movies who never show fear or sadness, to advertisements that highlight stoic, unflappable men, these images tell boys that anything less than complete emotional control is unacceptable. When boys see this portrayal of masculinity in both their homes and the wider culture, they learn to bury their emotions in order to fit the mold of what society expects of them. This familial and cultural conditioning, however, comes with a heavy price. Suppressing emotions, particularly crying, leaves boys with little space to process pain, grief, or confusion. Instead of learning how to express themselves in healthy ways, they internalize their feelings, which can lead to frustration, anxiety, or even depression as they grow older. For some, these emotional pressures can extend into adulthood, where they feel uncomfortable showing vulnerability or seeking help when needed. The fear of being judged or labeled as weak often leads men to isolate themselves emotionally, further perpetuating a cycle of silence and emotional strain. However, breaking free from these cultural and familial expectations is possible, though it requires a conscious shift in how we raise boys. It begins with changing the narrative at home, encouraging open discussions about feelings and allowing boys the freedom to express sadness, fear, and even joy without judgment. Parents can lead by example, showing that it's okay to cry and that doing so doesn't make someone any less strong or capable. By fostering an environment of emotional openness, families can create a safe space for boys to embrace their vulnerability without fear of retribution or shame. On a larger scale, challenging these cultural norms requires a collective effort. It means creating media representations that reflect a broader spectrum of masculinity, one where men can cry, show compassion, and seek help when they need it. It also means teaching boys early on that emotional intelligence and self-awareness are just as important as physical strength and independence. This shift won't happen overnight, but it is a necessary step toward redefining masculinity in a way that allows boys to grow into well-rounded, emotionally healthy men. By recognizing the power of cultural and familial influence, we can begin to create a society where boys don't have to hide their tears, and where emotional vulnerability is seen as a strength, not a weakness. Number 4. Emotional suppression's impact. The phrase, "a boy doesn't cry easily," may seem like a simple statement, but it reflects a deeper and more concerning reality about emotional suppression and its impact on young boys. From a young age, many boys are taught to hide their emotions, especially sadness or vulnerability, under the belief that these expressions are signs of weakness. Society often encourages this emotional repression, with the notion that real men must be stoic and unshaken by feelings. This conditioning starts early, whether through comments like "toughen up" or the unspoken rule that crying is unmanly. As a result, boys grow up learning to suppress their emotions, creating a disconnection from their own feelings. The consequences of this emotional suppression are far-reaching. Over time, the feelings that are suppressed don't simply disappear. They accumulate, often manifesting as anxiety, anger, depression, or even physical stress. Boys and young men who are unable to express their emotions can struggle with forming close relationships or seeking help when they need it, leading to isolation and emotional burnout. This disconnection from their emotions makes it harder to cope with life's challenges, as they have never been given the tools to process their feelings in a healthy way. The toll it takes on mental health is undeniable, with studies showing higher rates of depression and suicide among men, particularly those who were raised under these restrictive ideals of masculinity. But the good news is that emotional suppression is not inevitable. By acknowledging the harm that comes from these societal expectations and encouraging boys and men to express their emotions openly, we can begin to break the cycle. When boys are given the space to cry, to feel, and to communicate their inner struggles, they become healthier, more emotionally intelligent individuals, better able to navigate relationships and mental health challenges. Changing the narrative around masculinity and emotional expression is crucial to creating a society where vulnerability is seen as a strength, not a weakness, and where boys grow into men who are not afraid to embrace their emotions. Number 5. Boys do cry, just not publicly. The phrase "boys don't cry" has been ingrained in our culture for generations, leading to the misconception that boys and men are somehow immune to tears, emotions, or vulnerability. However, the reality is far different. Boys do cry, but often not in public, not where others can see. From an early age, boys are taught that emotional expression, particularly crying, is a sign of weakness, a trait considered feminine and therefore beneath them. This societal expectation is reinforced by family members, peers, and even media, shaping the way boys perceive their emotional responses and their own self-worth. Boys quickly learn that in order to be accepted or seen as strong, they must suppress their tears even when they are overwhelmed by grief, frustration, or sadness. As a result, the image of the stoic, emotionless boy becomes the standard, with any form of emotional release being hidden away in private spaces. But this emotional repression comes at a significant cost. The truth is that when boys are taught to hold back their tears, they are also being taught to suppress their emotions. The societal expectation that boys must man up or be tough when they experience hardship does not allow them the space to process their feelings in a healthy way. Instead of talking about what hurts, they bottle it up, internalizing their pain. While this may seem like an acceptable coping mechanism in the short term, over time it can lead to harmful effects on mental health. Boys who are conditioned to hide their emotions often grow up into men who struggle with emotional regulation, self-awareness, and meaningful emotional connections with others. The long-term result can be increased levels of anxiety, depression, and loneliness, as well as a higher likelihood of substance abuse or even suicide. It's important to understand that just because boys don't cry in public doesn't mean they don't cry at all. In fact, many boys shed tears in private, away from the prying eyes of friends, family, and society. They might cry alone in their bedrooms, in their cars, or in the quiet moments of the night when no one is watching. This private expression of emotion is a coping mechanism, a way for them to deal with the overwhelming feelings that society tells them they shouldn't show. But even in these private moments, the shame they feel for crying can be just as harmful as the public stigma. Boys are taught to associate their tears with something wrong, something to be hidden, something that makes them less of a man. And so, even in solitude, they are left with the burden of feeling like their emotions are somehow invalid, unworthy of attention, or a source of shame. The question then becomes, how can we change this narrative? How can we create a world where boys are allowed to cry openly without judgment or fear of ridicule? The answer lies in redefining what it means to be strong. Strength is not about suppressing emotions or pretending to be invulnerable. True strength comes from the ability to acknowledge and express one's feelings, to ask for help when needed, and to be open about emotional experiences. When we allow boys to cry, to express vulnerability, we teach them that it's okay to be human. Crying is not a sign of weakness. It's a natural, healthy response to the emotional challenges we all face. The more we normalize emotional expression in boys, the more we break down the toxic stereotypes that tie masculinity to emotional repression. The reality is, boys do cry. They just don't cry in public because they're taught not to. They cry in private, often in the quietest, most hidden spaces of their lives. But if we as a society can shift the narrative around masculinity and emotional expression, we can create an environment where boys feel safe to express their emotions openly, whether in public or in private. Boys who are encouraged to cry, to talk about their feelings, and to be vulnerable grow into men who are emotionally healthy, self-aware, and capable of forming deeper, more authentic connections with others. This is not just about teaching boys that it's okay to cry. It's about teaching them that it's okay to feel, to be vulnerable, and to be true to themselves without the fear of judgment. It's time to end the myth that boys don't cry and instead celebrate the truth that boys, just like everyone else, have the right to express their emotions freely and openly. No 6. The importance of vulnerability. The phrase, "a boy doesn't cry easily," is often used to symbolize strength and resilience in many cultures. But what if the real strength lies not in suppressing emotions, but in embracing vulnerability? From a young age, boys are taught to be tough, to hold back their tears, and to hide their emotions as if vulnerability is something to be feared. Society has constructed this idea that men, especially boys, must present a facade of stoicism, toughness, and unshakable confidence at all times. But the truth is that this rigid definition of masculinity not only harms boys, but also strips them of a fundamental aspect of human experience: the ability to be vulnerable. Vulnerability isn't a weakness, it's an essential part of being human. It's through vulnerability that we connect with others, understand ourselves more deeply, and navigate the complexities of life with emotional intelligence. Without the ability to be vulnerable, boys and men often find themselves trapped in a cycle of emotional suppression, where their feelings are buried beneath layers of societal expectations and personal shame. This emotional repression doesn't just prevent them from crying, it prevents them from experiencing the full range of emotions that make life meaningful. In a world where emotional expression is often seen as unmasculine, boys grow up learning to shut off their emotions, to avoid crying, and to bottle up pain, frustration, or sadness. They learn to hide behind a mask of strength and invulnerability, but this mask becomes a prison. The longer boys are taught that vulnerability is something to be avoided, the harder it becomes to navigate their emotions when they face difficult situations in life. Suppressing vulnerability creates an emotional disconnect, both with themselves and with others. It can lead to feelings of isolation, anxiety, and depression. Boys who are not encouraged to express their emotions may struggle with communication in relationships and find it difficult to ask for help when they need it. Over time, this builds up emotional barriers that make it harder for them to form deep, authentic connections with others. The notion that boys must be tough and unfeeling creates a toxic cycle where emotional health is sacrificed in favor of maintaining an image of strength that is actually fragile at its core. What society often fails to understand is that vulnerability is the cornerstone of emotional well-being. When boys are allowed to cry, to feel sad, or to express their fear and uncertainty, they are opening themselves up to a fuller experience of life. Vulnerability fosters empathy, connection, and emotional resilience. It allows boys to process their emotions in a healthy way, rather than bottling them up until they explode. This doesn't just make them more emotionally intelligent, it also helps them to become more compassionate, understanding, and connected with those around them. Vulnerability is the key to breaking down the walls that prevent people from truly knowing and supporting one another. When a boy is encouraged to be vulnerable, he learns that it's okay to not have all the answers, that it's okay to be uncertain, and that it's okay to express weakness. This opens the door for healing, growth, and self-awareness. Allowing boys to embrace vulnerability also prepares them for a healthier, more fulfilling future. Emotional intelligence is one of the most important skills in life, and it begins with understanding and accepting one's own emotions. A boy who learns to be vulnerable will grow into a man who is capable of navigating his emotional landscape with self-awareness and maturity. He will be better equipped to handle the inevitable challenges that life throws at him, whether that's dealing with loss, failure, or difficult relationships, because he has developed the emotional tools to cope and grow from those experiences. Vulnerability is not about weakness, it's about emotional courage. It's the courage to face difficult emotions head-on, to share them with others, and to ask for support when needed. This bravery is what leads to true emotional strength. The importance of vulnerability extends beyond individual emotional health. It impacts the broader culture as well. When boys are taught that it's okay to be vulnerable, it helps to dismantle harmful stereotypes about masculinity. It challenges the idea that men must always be the strong, silent type, and it opens the door for a more inclusive, emotionally supportive culture where both men and women are free to express themselves without fear of judgment. Vulnerability allows men to embrace their full humanity, joy, sadness, fear, hope, and everything in between, without the burden of having to conform to an unrealistic standard. It creates spaces where men can express love, seek help, and connect deeply with others, which ultimately leads to healthier, more fulfilling lives. In the end, it's clear that vulnerability is not something to be feared or avoided. It's a powerful tool for emotional growth, connection, and resilience. The more boys are encouraged to embrace their vulnerability, the more they will develop into emotionally well-rounded individuals capable of navigating the complexities of life with strength and authenticity. It's time to redefine what it means to be strong. Real strength lies in the courage to be vulnerable, to express one's feelings, and to face life's challenges with an open heart. When we teach boys that it's okay to cry, to express their emotions, and to embrace vulnerability, we are helping to build a world where everyone, regardless of gender, can thrive emotionally and mentally. True emotional strength is found in vulnerability, and it's time we start teaching boys that this is not only acceptable, it's essential. Number 7. Breaking the cycle. From the time a boy is young, society begins shaping how he should behave, how he should feel, and how he should express himself. One of the most deeply ingrained messages is that boys don't cry. Crying is seen as a weakness, something to be avoided at all costs. Instead of being allowed to process emotions naturally, boys are taught to suppress them, to hide their vulnerability behind a mask of strength and stoicism. This expectation of toughness is everywhere, at home, at school, in sports, and even in the media. Boys hear phrases like, "be a man," "don't be a crybaby," or "boys don't cry," over and over again, often without realizing the harm they do. These words don't just teach boys how to behave in a moment of distress, they lay the foundation for a lifetime of emotional suppression. As they grow older, this emotional conditioning only deepens. The cycle of repressing feelings becomes second nature, and it can be incredibly difficult for boys to break free from this expectation. But the cost of this cycle is steep. When emotions are buried, they don't disappear. Instead, they manifest in different, often unhealthy ways. Anxiety, depression, anger, and even substance abuse are just some of the consequences that come from suppressing feelings over time. Boys and later men may find themselves struggling to form meaningful relationships because they have never been taught how to communicate their emotions openly. The idea that strength lies in silence can leave them feeling isolated and disconnected from the very people they care about most. This cycle not only affects individual boys, but it impacts society as a whole, perpetuating harmful stereotypes and limiting the emotional growth of entire generations. To break this cycle, we must first recognize the problem. It's time we stop telling boys that emotions are a sign of weakness and start teaching them that emotional expression is a sign of strength. Breaking the cycle means allowing boys to cry when they need to feel their emotions fully, and to understand that being vulnerable doesn't make them less of a man. It makes them more human. It means giving them the tools to express sadness, frustration, fear, and joy without shame. It means creating a culture where feelings are not gendered, where crying is seen as a healthy release and not a character flaw. This isn't just about changing the way we raise boys, it's about reshaping our entire understanding of masculinity. True strength lies not in hiding emotions, but in embracing them. It's about teaching boys that it's okay to cry, to talk about what they're going through, and to seek help when they need it. By breaking the cycle, we free boys from the weight of societal expectations, and in doing so, we create a more compassionate, understanding world where emotional health is valued just as much as physical strength. The journey to breaking this cycle won't be easy, but it is necessary. When we allow boys to cry, we give them the freedom to be their authentic selves, and in that authenticity, we find strength, growth, and healing. It's time to break the cycle, and in doing so, we empower boys to grow into emotionally intelligent men who are comfortable with who they are, emotions, tears, and all. As we've seen, vulnerability isn't a sign of weakness, it's the heart of emotional resilience and true strength. By allowing boys to embrace their feelings, to cry, and to express themselves without shame, we are paving the way for healthier, more authentic lives. It's time we break the cycle of emotional suppression and teach our boys that vulnerability is not only okay, it's essential. Let's create a world where emotional expression is celebrated and strength is found in the courage to be real. Together, we can build a future where every boy feels empowered to be his true, emotional self.